Okay, I think it's all working. Check, check, 1, 2.
Check. Well, we can't tell.
Yeah, it's true. I'm just so used to it.
Yeah.
So it's funny, I bought this a while ago and I thought, I'm going to record a whole song on this. Then I talked to you about it. And it just sounds like a huge headache for what I want to do. But I think, instead of going through my mic pre's, I'm going to just try somehow to record a song without too much high-tech intervention, So how would you go about, like, if you had this thing to record a drum, would you go through a board and do 2 tracks or what?
Yeah, it's 8 tracks. So we've talked about the different scenarios, but it's got 4 mic pre's, so you've got that, but you have to have mic pre's for the other 8 other 4 inputs.
Okay.
So I mean, if you had like an old Mackie board or something like that, you could just go easy and just come out of the buses into the line ins on the other 4 inputs. You do have your fancy mic pre's, but that might not give you the true idea of what you want.
Yeah, I kind of want, the challenge of doing it the worst way possible.
Yeah.
So if you had that many tracks to work with, would you go 6 and bounce down to 2, or how would you do that?
If you're going to add to it, yeah, if you're going to try to do a whole song, well, you could do either way. I mean, like the early days, I used to do 6 tracks and then do a stereo bounce to 7 and 8. And then wipe them out and do other parts on the other tracks.
When you wiped them out, would you ever save them so you could? No, it was
no, because I didn't have a way of doing that.
Okay,
and I didn't have a way of, nowadays if you were going to do that on analog, you would do your bounce to 2 tracks and then make a safety of that.
Yeah,
and then you've got all you can wipe them out. But
so back then you had to basically burn the boats.
You were committed to it, and you just get rid of it. But then later when I got a digital audio tape, a DAT machine, I would just record all 8 and then do the stereo mix to the DAT tape.
Okay.
And then that's how you could save the original master. And then I would just run the DAT tape back to 2 tracks on an empty space.
I forgot about that.
And then start from there.
So a DAT machine basically gave you 2 more tracks in a weird way, like not virtual tracks, but 2 tracks to bounce down to. And then you could come back with no loss of quality.
Yeah.
Okay, so this takes...
And you could do it later. Sorry, and you could do it later because then, that way you're using all 8, but you could then spend a bunch of time after the recording, mix it the way you wanted to.
Because you could use the first 2 tracks as like a reference track, kind of, and record everything. And then you could come back, make the drums sound even better, and bounce them back down to the 2 tracks, right?
No, you'd have all your 8 tracks recorded of drums. Right, so maybe actually what I did was 7, and then I would do a guide track on 8. So it'd be a guitar player or
gotcha.
Something, so you had a way of what to play to. You know, so you'd have that. So it'd be 7 tracks, and then you would mute the guide track, mix your drums the way you were after it was recorded. Mix them the way you want, put some reverb on the snare and the toms or whatever, and then mix that and record that to the 2 track.
The DAT machine.
The DAT machine.
Okay.
And then take the mix of the drums, put it back to a new spot on the reel or whatever you're working on until they say 7 and 8 or something, or 1 and 2. And then start with bass and guitar and vocals.
Gotcha.
And you usually had 6 more tracks to do that.
That must have felt really fancy, though, to have a DAT machine for the first time. But I want to go before you even had that, because I learned about all that stuff, the DAT machine stuff. Was that through you, or was it through maybe Bill Bailey or somebody?
Well, yeah, no, because we would have recorded stuff to a DAT before I even owned one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I thought we were always wondering what he was bouncing to.
Yep.
Which is interesting. But so you started recording after we did all of our Sanctus recordings, so you kind of had the bug, right?
Let's see. I started in the middle of them, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was it, the Red Album, Done with Reliance?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the time.
That was our second time with Bill Bailey. I think you were just starting to get interested in it.
Yeah, maybe that's what it was.
Okay.
Maybe it was after those 2.
He was a good example to follow. He wasn't one of those angry engineers, so maybe that made you more...
But you know what? The funny thing is we didn't talk hardly at all. I didn't really know him like that at the time because I wasn't super into it. I was more thinking about being a drummer in the studio. Yeah. But then later we kind of realized, hey, what he was doing sounded really good.
He knew what he was doing.
Yeah, and we just didn't realize it at the time. You went in this little dusty basement of his studio, Mirror Image Studios.
Remember that stairwell? I was like, how are we going to get our drums through that?
Yeah, exactly. And then later, again, we would realize he got great sounds for really quick.
Yeah. He would just dial it up. He knew how to get your kick drum sounding right for metal.
Yep.
And then he had what, a half-inch 16
half
track?
Inch 16 track. Yep.
Okay, reel to reel.
Yep.
And for us, that was like the big time, even though
Yeah.
we knew about 24 tracks, I think, at the time. But
we didn't even.
Oh, we didn't?
Not by then yet, because late. It was
Wait,
like later
we saw
on.
a video of like Metallica using
I
the bigger
suppose,
tapes, but
yeah.
that was about the
Yeah.
extent of it. But to know we were going to like reel to reel tape, it just was cool. That's all we really had.
Yeah.
But then to be in a real studio for the first time, we didn't know what he was doing, but he seemed like a magician, just making
Yeah.
everything work. And you're right, he was more like no nonsense, like all business basically. And he got
Yeah.
it done. I forgot how many hours we booked out, but it wasn't very many.
It was
6,
maybe
maybe?
4 to 6 hours. Yeah.
To do an entire demo. of
3 songs.
3
yeah.
songs.
Yeah.
From start to finish, mixing and everything, mastering, well, whatever you could do back
Yep.
then to master.
But I mean, from a performance standpoint, we were so rehearsed,
Yeah,
and
especially
we weren't
the
trying to
second
do any experimentation in the studio. We were just trying to capture what we did.
the only thing we knew we wanted to do, I think, because Al heard it from somebody, that you're supposed to double the vocals.
Oh yeah,
Thank God, because it makes it sound
Yeah.
really cool. But I think Bill actually recommended punch-ins and stuff, and he taught us a few new things we didn't know about, I
yeah.
believe. So.
And you running your solo through a
Through my
practice
crate, yeah. I did a video to try to justify that, vindicate myself.
Yeah.
But yeah, I rebought. It's behind you right there, the Crate GX15.
Yeah.
You wanna
Oh, that's
kick it
awesome.
over later? Chris
Yeah.
hated that, but I swear to God, the tone cuts through. People listen to that album and they go, "Man, you guys sound like Testament or something." And I'm like, if you only knew the amps we were using. I think I was using my PV with a DS1 or something, and Al had his Crate. It was
yeah.
so crazy, but
Yeah.
whatever, it worked. That album still gets talked about, and actually, I'm
Yeah.
doing a video tonight about one of the songs, so that
That's
should
awesome.
be cool. So when you started getting interested in it, the first iteration of your studio that I can remember is you bought a reel-to-reel and a big desktop. Was it Tascam board with
Yeah.
big fat knobs?
It was called the M16.
Okay, so can you tell like more specifically what those were?
Yeah. Well, I'll backtrack a little bit because this machine right here was one that I wanted to get something like this. This was my original plan.
With a cassette?
Was to get. They made a version like this that was in a rack that had 8 tracks in a rack, and then you had to get a separate mixer.
Oh, in a rack.
Yeah, and that was the one I wanted, but it was like $3,000.
Okay.
And because the only recording experience besides going to the studio was the 4-track version of this.
Yeah, Tascam 424, I think.
Yep.
The gray one.
You
yeah.
got it. And those, we would do the internal bouncing and it would sound just awful. But those were common.
knobs. Ooh,
And
same
there
here.
was like a high and a low EQ.
That's right, no mid-range.
Yep. And it was just really minimal. But so that was like, I knew I wanted to step it up from that because I really wanted like a real studio.
Yeah.
So my version of stepping it up was the 8-track separate from the mixer. And then I started looking around and I found this Tascam 80-8, which I had no idea what I was buying. I had no idea that the tape width gave the thicker your tape or the wider your tape, the better quality you had.
Yeah.
So it was kind of dumb luck that I got a 1/2-inch 8-track because at the time, 1/4-inch 8-track was kind of the standard.
Oh, okay.
But by jumping up another half, another quarter to a 1/2 inch was giving you more tape width per track, which was also a higher quality sound. So, but they all looked old and I didn't know. And I just stumbled across this thing and my parents said, okay, we'll buy you this 8-track machine and we'll start from there. And then
Do you remember how much it was?
I don't.
Okay.
If I was to guess, I would say about $600 or $800, something
Okay.
like that. Because the reel-to-reels were not that cheap then, but that was definitely more affordable than a 16-track 1-inch or a 24-track 2-inch.
Plus, you play drums. They're probably used to spending a lot of money on stuff.
Yeah.
We were just talking
Yeah.
about your old cymbals, $300 a piece or
Yeah.
whatever. So,
Yeah.
okay.
Well, again, it was just kind of weird, dumb luck because I was talking to some people and kind of bouncing things off. And And actually, that's one of the things how we met Gary, how we went in to record later, is I bought some of his stuff.
Okay. I didn't know that, actually.
Yeah, since we're going back. I bought the 8-track, half-inch 8-track, and then I started with this. I used our live soundboard that we had.
Ross or whatever?
I think it was a Ross.
Yeah. Weird
it was awful.
Yeah.
Like really awful.
We had to buy it in an emergency gig situation where we were playing Ramsey County Fair, and we couldn't play unless we provided the PA system. So Chris's dad stepped it up, man. And I remember you guys coming home with those big gray PA speakers, and somehow we got it to work.
Yeah. A big, heavy PA speakers.
Power amp.
A power amp, and then that bad mixer.
The Ross board, yeah.
Yeah.
Why was it so bad? Was it just real hard to use?
I think it was old. It was crusty. Like you would... it was like you would turn the mic pre and it would go from here to like here.
Okay.
And it had no headroom. So, but to get the level to what you wanted, you had to have it high enough. So, but it would distort. And I remember, plus not knowing anything about gain staging either.
This was brand new.
Not really knowing what we were doing, not knowing what a fader means compared to the mic pre-gain.
Yeah.
You just
wonder if he had it all cranked on the gain.
Probably.
And poor Spencer, his friend, was running sound for us at the gig. And he's sitting right in front of the stage, which is funny because he's not even far back enough to really hear it.
Yeah.
And did he ever really actually move any knobs?
He must have. I don't know.
Okay.
We just cared about what we were doing.
It worked.
He handled what he was doing, and people liked it. So
he pulled it off somehow.
Yeah.
We had 2 nights there. One was a daytime show, and one was a nighttime show.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't remember that.
I had them both on video once, but now I only have the daytime show. The nighttime show is the one where I jumped off your riser and hit my head on the top of the ceiling.
Totally don't remember any of that.
Yeah, I should not remember that after hitting my head. But okay, yeah. So that Ross board is what you started with the 8-track. I forgot about that. Did you have any outboard compressors?
At that time, nothing. Because I knew that board was just a temporary thing to get rolling and get the idea.
Okay.
Start to understand how to get something out of a single channel. Because when I would start, I just only knew how to run everything through the channels and then go to the master and then record the master.
Okay.
So then when I started to realize, wait a second, there's things called tracks, and you can start to get individual microphones to go through tracks. Then I realized that there's something called an insert on there. There was no direct outs on the console on that board. So I realized, though, an insert is made up of a send and a return. So if you plug a cable in halfway, it becomes a send, and it can then become a direct out.
That's how you went to the tape machine?
That's how I went to the tape machine, was plugging a cable halfway into the insert.
Is that common for a board not to have direct outs?
On cheaper consoles, yeah.
Okay.
For sure.
Okay.
Because they wouldn't, and especially if it was a live console,
that
which
makes
this
sense.
was.
Yeah.
There's no real reason to have direct outs.
Makes sense.
At the time. And then when you get into more recording consoles, they would add the direct outs, but some of the early ones didn't have many direct outs. They'd have inserts where you could do a send and return for outboard gear, or you could just use them as direct outs.
So was that on purpose, or was that like a hack? Somebody figured out that if you put it halfway, you can.
I think it's on purpose.
It seems kind of chintzy. Just pull it out halfway. Hope it stays.
Well, no, the whole idea is you'd have a TRS cable, a tip ring sleeve cable, and if you plug it in all the way, that's how you would get the tip of the cable would be the return, and the insert, or the negative side, the ring, would be the send. So you would have that all in one cable. So it's just an unbalanced way to do an insert to get signal to and from gear.
Okay.
Yeah.
I always thought you just hacked it. Like, hey, whoops.
No, at the time I thought I was. Okay. I was like, hey, I don't know, but I just pushed this in halfway and it does what we need to do. And
guerrilla
that's
tactics.
how I learned almost everything. And you just kind of do it, and then you ask somebody and they'll go, well, yeah, I guess that does work. And
that's kind of cool because you didn't have YouTube to look anything up.
Yeah.
I mean, you could have maybe called Bill or Gary, but you didn't really know them that well yet.
Right. Wow. And Gary was a big mentor of mine. So that's how I learned a bunch. And then realizing that was kind of my next stage was I needed to get a real mixer. Couldn't afford anything serious. And then I met Gary, and he had this Tascam console that was like taken apart and like standing up in his closet.
Oh my God.
And that used to be his main recording board. And then he upgraded to a Soundcraft that we use.
Standing up, you just mean it was like on its back?
Yeah,
kinda?
it was just taken apart and
Okay.
like, there was a blanket over it. And he's like, oh, I've got this, and I'm like, I'll buy that. And
Looks cool.
yeah. And it's just, I mean, the console itself, I think was at least 5 feet wide.
It was huge.
And it was like, I think at most it was 16 channels.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
But what the cool thing was, and again, I had no idea at the time, it was a split design console. So what that means is that the channel path, the recording part where you put the mics in, is on one side, and then the monitor part where you would hear your tape machine back was on a completely separate side.
Gotcha.
So there was separate faders over there. Versus what they call an inline design console, which is that the channel strip has both a channel path and a monitor path built in together. Or a live console, which there isn't 2 paths. There's just channel path only.
Oh.
That's how you get to your recorder, because you don't need 2 paths when you're in the live world.
Okay.
You just need your channels to go to the master to go to your speakers.
And then for monitors, you would just do like a send out?
Yeah, for stage monitors.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But when you're working with the tape machine, you have to have a way to get to it and then have a way to come back and listen to it after the tape machine. So,
Okay. So
yeah. So I had no idea, but that by buying this console, it totally put me into a whole new world, because now I have not only a 16 channel console, I have 16 channels on one side plus 16 returns as well. So I could then utilize those at different times and have more inputs, say for like reverb returns and delays and that kind of stuff for later.
In a way, it's good. It was a kind of like confusing because it forced you to figure it out, right?
Totally.
Okay.
Totally. I mean, it wasn't, at the time I had no idea there was even 2 different console or designs,
Yeah.
It was like, well, this is what he's got and I can afford it. So sure. And it took multiple people to lift the dang thing.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because later on, my next console was a 32 channel console, and it was like 1.5 feet smaller than that other console that I had.
A lot lighter too, right?
Yes.
I mean, it still was heavy, but
yep.
I remember that Mac. Well, I was going to ask you, so when you went to buy Gary's board, did you have another in mind that was it the Mackie 32x8, or were you just like...
Oh no, the Mac, it didn't even exist when I bought it. The
Okay.
Mackie wasn't even out yet.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you didn't even know there was anything, like you didn't have any goal board. You just knew that was cool looking, I'm going to get it and just try it out.
It basically was the deal where, I just knew I needed to get something else. And, there was City Pages out there. There was like Guitar Center and, some of those other places, but any of the new stuff I couldn't buy. I just couldn't afford. So
what about like Metro or those kind of places did you know about them yet?
no.
Okay.
Metro Sound and Lighting.
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
that came later. Cause Guitar Center I knew because I was, walking to the drum department all the time.
Yeah, and you would
and then
see
I'd be like, hey, what's this? So then I just eventually just started going over to the Pro Audio side,
That's right. Did they have a lot of recording stuff, or was it a lot of live stuff more?
Yeah, no. At that time, they had a separate room that was for recording stuff. But it was like the Tascam M3500 and M3700. Those were like the ones that I wanted to get. Again, and looking back, those were junk too. But they were like $5,000 to $7,000.
Wow.
And again, that was like nowhere I could even consider looking into, and that's why it was like, well, what I could afford was in the new market was not very good. Didn't have much settings, didn't have a very good EQ, didn't have that split design that I was looking at, and so that's why I jumped at that Tascam to get started with.
Did every channel work? Because that thing looks like you had to fix it up.
No, it did actually.
Okay, that's good.
Gary took care of all of his stuff because it was in a working studio. So, and it was even though it was Tascam, it was older Tascam, which Tascam, I don't even know, they're not. I think they're still around actually.
Okay.
But over the years, it wasn't a very good brand. But the early days, Tascam did make some higher level stuff, and they actually made. This, I think it was like the 520 series or something. I look back and it was definitely even a way step above what I had.
Okay.
Because it had a parametric EQ, which was a much bigger, more options there. But anyways, looking at that, it was a great option to kind of go that route, and it was affordable. And one other really cool thing that since it was a real console, it didn't have like all the connections on the top. It had it all behind
in the back, yeah.
Which meant that I suddenly needed to learn how to wire a patch bay.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
so all of a sudden I'm like I had no idea what I was doing, but the next thing you know, I'm like learning how to wire a TT patch bay, which stands for tiny telephone. I didn't even know what that was.
Yeah.
I just assumed that's what they all were.
I called you TT boy for a while.
Yeah, but it turns out that that's what they used to use in the military, and is a really popular patch bay setup. And again, it was the track of the pro level stuff, because if I would have stayed at what my original plans was, I would have had a Porta Studio. If I had a patch bay, it would have been like a chintzy 1/4-inch patch bay,
right,
which was fine, but not on the like pro level that I learned how to do.
And you wouldn't have had to like actually solder and all that stuff?
Yeah, so I had never soldered at all. And then Gary taught me how to solder. He showed me how to solder a mic cable, a patch point, and then said, here you go. And he just sold me like bags full of connectors and the patch bays not wired with bulk cabling. Jeez. And he showed me how to just like make my own snakes. And then I just went in and burnt my hands like crazy and it just went for it, you know.
Did you pull off the first couple of cables, or did you have to like try a few times before you finally nailed it?
Oh, I know I messed a lot up, actually.
Okay.
And honestly, a lot of the times was I had no idea that I did. So I would just wire, and then you'd try to do a session and like,
man,
this channel wasn't working. Yep. And then you're
no
like, try. But that's how you learn. That's the troubleshooting. And
well, that's how you learned. I wonder if people nowadays, it's too easy maybe. I don't know. I hate to be that guy, but you went through so much pain. I feel like that's why now you seem to know things inside and out, and you just don't know them on the surface like I do. So if I was to run sound for somebody, I only know what you've shown me. But if all of a sudden I had to go back and fix a TT cable, I don't even know if we use them still, but I'd be screwed.
But you know, the same things exist now. It's just different. Like if you're somebody starting off and you're teaching yourself, you're starting with a computer, and then an error pops up on your computer and you got to figure that out.
That's true.
It's kind of the same thing. You know, you don't either you choose to just push it aside and go play video games, or you go look online, or you find a way to just figure out how to get a different driver or how to do this, you know, how to optimize your computer in certain ways. And I mean, you know, there's that, you know, and then you get a bunch of cables, and then maybe a cable breaks, and you decide, well, maybe I could try to fix that cable, you know.
That's the first step, is like poverty, like not being able to just buy a new cable. You have to fix it. I love that kind of stuff because it really really drives it home.
Totally.
Sorry, I was just trying to think of if you recorded a lot of bands on that Tascam, or what, did you wait till the Mackie?
No, I did a lot of bands. With that 80-8 and having a 16-channel console and then an 8-track recorder was great, because then what I started then is trying to make the most out of my 8 tracks. So I'd start to add more microphones, and then what I started doing was recording my toms down to 2 tracks. So I would take less tracks up. But my goal was to try not to bounce things internally if I could.
Yeah.
So what I did, instead of bouncing my drums, I would record the kick on one track and the snare on the others, and then I would record all my toms and on my overheads onto 2 tracks.
Okay.
Together, mixed together. So I had 4 tracks of drums, but that left me the control to mix the kick and mix the snare, and then my drums left and right overall.
Wow.
So I could add a different snare verb on certain songs, or I could EQ the kick and snare differently.
Okay.
I can compress those a little bit, but I was stuck with my toms and overhead mixes. But by having the 16-channel console, I could do multiple mics on the toms. I could do multiple overheads, and then eventually I'd put up a couple room mics and blend that in. So I'd have more microphones than I was had tracks. But it was kind of getting me ready to needing to have more tracks, and that was the next point.
That. Yeah. That's when you knew you had to go to the next step. It's kind of like it tells you when you should move on.
Yeah.
Which is cool. So do you remember that first kick drum mic you bought? What was it again? It had a strange look to it.
Yeah. Oh, there was the AKG D12E.
Okay.
AKG D12E.
Silver and black?
Yeah. Okay. Silver on one side and black. And again, that's another just looking back, a really funny example, because now that kick drum mic is extremely sought after.
I'm sure. Yeah, everything we've sold.
Yeah, it's so funny. I had matter of fact, because it was my most expensive mic that I had, I used it on vocals.
Okay.
I had no idea if that it really was a kick drum mic. I used it on the kick drum, but it was the only mic that I had besides, a 57 or whatever. So I just put it up on as a vocal mic, and
kind of looks like an Elvis mic
in
a way.
Yeah, it had that look, but I mean, it was a crappy vocal mic, but I just use it. And, at the time I bought that with, I'll get my dad, mom and dad always supported. So, they would, I bought this kick drum mic and a couple of 57s, and I think a 58 or something like that. It was just this like guy's drum package that he had. And that was just kind of the starting point which was great. Because again, I could have bought it could have just got this realistic microphone.
Yeah, made a trip to Radio Shack.
Yeah, and instead I end up with this AKG D12E, which is, it goes back to the earlier versions of the D12E where the Beatles used, so like the earlier versions, but they had a two-shell connector instead of a XLR. So you had to have a fancy adapter. If you found one of those are, I forgot the model number. Some of the Beatles fans will know. It's crazy. Like the D15 or something, D25.
So what did you use on the toms? Was it all 57s on everything else pretty much, or overheads, or what else did you have?
Yeah, I was 57s pretty much. And then I did buy some Audio-Technica Pro 37s.
Okay.
That's so funny because I actually just bought a pair of those again to have a secondary backup for overheads for my live setup. So I wanted to have two separate mic packages. And they've gone way up too in price. They're still made. They're actually really great for the money.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, all my old stuff too, including my 80-8, my buddy Jay Kruger has all that stuff.
Oh, he does.
He bought all that stuff from me and put it to really good use. And
now he's laughing because he's like, it's going to be his retirement fund.
Yeah. I think he's still got the 80-8 in the corner for looks. But he used that one for a long time.
I love that you've sold things to the friends we both know.
Yeah.
So I think Brett Michael still has your PA. What does he have of yours?
He just was selling those speakers.
Yeah.
I traded him some speakers. He had some Westlake speakers that he got.
Yeah.
And
that's how we did it back then.
Yeah, we just traded. And I hate selling equipment because
you'll just loan things to me just to have, just so you don't lose it.
It meant so much to me when I would get a piece, of gear. I remember I remember almost everything in every moment when I got something,
That's
because it was like a big part of my next step of my career,
It's your whole journey.
Yeah. So they were that's something to me that I always really enjoyed because I wasn't born with $1 million or whatever. So I didn't get to buy it all at once. It was
Thank God.
Which is great. Yeah. I look back now, of course I wanted it all at once, but I look back and when I started to get, even with my 80-8, I started getting clients and I would charge them by project and I'd make $200-300 a demo. And look back now and that's really little money. But at the time, being in my parents' basement and not having any bills or anything, all that money just went right back into buying.
You always
equipment.
reinvested.
Yeah. So I can say, I did this project, and now I could buy this piece of gear and that piece of gear. And that made such a big impact for me. So I hate selling stuff. I still just do it because I don't like to see it go. I mean, I'd rather see it sit on my shelf being dusty.
I was going to say, I think I'm following in your footsteps over here.
Yeah.
It's really hard to let things go, especially if people might try to lowball you for it. And then once it's gone, this one guy came to buy one of my acoustics and he showed up and I said $600.
Yeah.
And he gets here and he plays it for a while and then he goes, I'll give you $300. I go, no, dude, I'm not even going to sell it,
Yeah.
And he haggled, and eventually we got to $450, and I said yes because I'm a pushover.
Yeah.
And he walks out the door, and I'm like, And he goes, oh, by the way, we started talking. He's like, yeah, I just read this book called Never Take the First Offer. So he was trying to like work his weird, psychological stuff on me. And after he left, I'm like, I don't feel like I ever want to sell anything ever again. Yeah. It left a bad feeling in my stomach,
It's one thing to sell something to a friend for a good deal because you're like, you're helping them. And then you can also talk with them down the road about like how they're using it.
How
and,
is
like,
it? Yeah.
Get them some ideas or whatever. That's way different, or just lend things, how that works.
One thing I think we'll get to eventually, but John still talks about the Paris system that he bought.
Oh, yeah.
And he's like, man, I don't know what to do with that thing. You think I could sell it? I'm like, only if it's for some like vintage head that wants some old school stuff, because he still has like the hardware and all that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so the big jump from there that I remember is the Mackie board 32x8. Mm-hmm. But you still use the reel-to-reel?
Yeah. Well,
for a while.
Before I upgraded the console, I switched to digital recording at that point.
Okay, I can't remember that transition. I just remember when the board came because you had that Pearl Jam night where you like hooked it all up, and I spent the night on the couch, and you were like, I don't know if I was helping you at first, and then I ditched you and I just went to sleep or something. But you listened to Pearl Jam 10 on infinite repeat, I remember.
That was when I was rewiring the studio.
For a recording session.
Because the next day, my mentor that I had, because I was doing a mentorship in my senior year of high school, and this guy had owned a studio, was a producer, and he was coming over to produce us and record at our studio.
That's right.
At my studio.
Fragmented?
Fragmented, yeah. Because that was like my senior project as a mentor with my mentorship program, was to record a song by us and mix it and finalize it and do all that.
So I have it mixed up a little bit. I thought it was when you first, like how soon from there did you get the Mackie board? Was it recent?
So that was when I got the Mackie board.
Okay, so it's close in time. Okay.
But before that, I had already got rid of the 80-8 and got into 2 ADAT machines.
So you were doing ADATs with that Tascam board?
Yeah, because I could do 16 channels.
That's crazy.
But when I wanted to go above that, then I had to get a new console because I didn't have enough inputs.
So you started with 2 ADAT machines? Because I thought it was just one.
Okay, so there's a couple of different elements that came in there. So I had the 80-8, 8 tracks. They had this new thing, machines called ADATs, Alesis ADATs, were 8-track digital recorders you would use basically high quality VHS tapes called
I had one up here.
SVHS tapes. But you could keep linking those machines for more tracks. So I bought one of those, and then again, that was my interest here, is I needed to find a way to integrate the two together. So I bought this BRC, this stands for Big Remote Control, and that was the remote for the ADAT, which could do SMPTE time code. So then I would stripe one track. I forgot
about this.
Yeah, so I would stripe SMPTE on track 8 of my 80-8, and then run that out to my BRC, and then I would sync the analog machine with the digital machine, and that's how I then got 15 tracks because
that's
I had to use the one for SMPTE. Yeah,
I can't believe you were you had to be that ambitious to have an ADAT synced up with a reel-to-reel machine.
Well, yeah, it was all built because I wanted more than 8 tracks. I needed more than 8 tracks. I could not at the time. At least his ADATs were $3,000, maybe $3,500 for each 8 tracks.
They're pretty premium.
So to just say I could get $6,000 to get 16 tracks was not happening. So that's how I got one machine, and then I had the other one, and then so that's when I started to get in that kind of digital realm and realizing, okay, that's cool. And I'm a little blurry on what happened next, because I think what I did then is I got a second ADAT machine, and then for 16 tracks digital, and then kind of retired the 80-8.
Instead of having an extra 7 tracks.
Yeah.
You just said,
I just kind of retired that, had 16 tracks, but then I bought my first Pro Tools system at that time, which was would have been early 90s. I got one of the first Pro Tools systems, which was called Sound Tools at the time. and it was the max you could do was 4 tracks.
Oh, you had 4. I thought it was 2.
Nope, it was 4 tracks. But I used to regularly because I also got into mastering, which was a program called Sound Designer.
Yeah.
But then there was Sound Tools, and then it turned into the first version of Pro Tools, which was what I had was Pro Tools 3.2.
Damn.
And you could. It was a Pro Tools TDM setup, so you had to have a Mac computer. I had a Mac 2 CI.
I was going to ask what kind of Mac it was. Yeah.
Yep, it was a 25 megahertz processor.
2 CI.
Yep, Apple 2 CI. 25 megahertz processor, which is unbelievably crazy that we did anything on that. Our watches and phones have way more processing than that.
Definitely. This looks like an old thing we had in elementary school.
Yeah.
The Mac
you could get for Pro Tools, it came with this PCI card that you had to put in. I don't even think it was called PCI at that. It was a NUBUS card is what they call it. It's NUBUS.
You put it in the
NUBUS.
Mac?
You put it in the Mac because that's how you hooked up your interface for Pro Tools.
Oh my God.
And so it was 4 tracks. And you could expand Pro Tools at that time to 12 tracks.
Okay.
If you had 3 NUBUS cards, plus you needed this thing called an accelerator card. It basically would have cost $12,000 to $14,000 if I wanted to expand it to 12 tracks.
Okay.
Never did that. I believe if I remember right, I bought the Mac and the Pro Tools 442 card, which is the 4-track, for like $2,700 or something.
Okay.
Like that.
That's way better than what I...
But at the time, I had 16 tracks recording. I was recording quite a few bands, in the studio. So I was already kind of, able to go ahead and invest in that.
Yeah, you're actually using it all.
Yeah, and I realized what I needed to find a way to start editing stuff better.
I wanted you to trigger my memory with ADATs.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you really quick. Back, first of all, I have nightmares still about recording accidentally over drum tracks on the BRC, arming things and disarming them. But sometimes if somebody hit something late and you wanted to move it, could you do that digitally with some kind of time, track delay?
Yeah.
How does that work? Because I can't.
Okay, so there was a couple things you could do with this. One thing that the BRC had for the ADATs is every track had a delay on it that you could tell it up to, I can't remember if it was like 180 milliseconds.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
Was there a limit to
yes,
how
there was
far
a
you
limit.
could move something? Okay.
So you could basically, what it would do is just put it in a buffer and it would just delay it however many milliseconds you needed. But it was the entire track, right? So if you had one, let's just say a vocal line that was delayed, or excuse me, that was early, and you wanted to push that back, what you would do is you would delay the track until it would be in time for that one line. Let's just say it was 15 milliseconds. And then you would record that to an empty track that didn't have track delay on it.
Okay.
So you've now captured that in the right time.
Sure.
And then you take the delay off of that other track and then grab it from the original track and put it back on the other track. This was all in real time. So you just reroute it and just do it, go over it with it delayed, record it, then take the delay off and then put it back onto the track. And now it'd be in time again. And you're good. But it was slow, but you could do it.
Yeah.
So it was like, well, who cares? It's not that slow. I mean,
it was worth it back then.
Yeah.
But now just you go, boom, that's all you got to do. It's so
and honestly, we use track delays more. I use that a lot in the hip hop world where we'd have a sequence track and the producer would come in with all the parts tracked out. And then we would maybe delay the snare, delay the kick by just a few frames,
just to give
that push back a little bit, laid back feel a little bit.
Interesting.
The other thing I would do is record a vocal to another track and then shift the second one back and make a little bit of a double track kind of.
Okay, yeah.
But that was kind of more of a robotic double.
Yeah.
So I didn't use it much, but it'd be kind of fun. You could do it with a guitar and then hard pan left and right, offset one of them, but it was kind of fake stereo,
So you wouldn't get what'd you call it? Big mono? So you'd offset it enough to make a difference.
Big mono is a different thing. That's just panning everything wide, and all it sounds is like it's back in the middle again.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you taught me about that.
Yeah.
I realized I had to start to just overdub.
Yeah.
It's like I just need to do two
Yeah.
takes.
So let me quickly finish the Pro Tools story because there's more to it. So then when I realized I wanted to start editing things more, I got this 4-track Pro Tools system, and it was great because then I did some commercials for people. So we would just do like voiceover, and then I could go in on the computer and edit out all of the breaths and then make it be, a minute or a 30-second spot. And I could put some music behind it and edit and get it exactly on. And so that kind of opened up a little bit of a new market for me too, just to do some of that. But then I realized that, boy, wouldn't it be cool if I could find a way to sync Pro Tools up with my ADATs and then transfer stuff back and forth.
Yeah.
So I bought this. They made this ADAT Bridge IO that Avid or DigiDesign at the time made, and it allowed me to transfer digitally from ADATs into Pro Tools. Basically, the wind had to be blowing in the right direction in order for it to work.
For it to sync?
Yeah, to get it to go. It was $1,000. I got it, and I did get it to go every once in a while, and it was great because then I could do editing and I could edit a whole bunch of stuff. But ultimately, though, you could edit with ADATs, and on our last record that we did, I did all the drum comping at my house. Even though we recorded at Gary's house, I would bring the tapes home, and then we did multiple takes of one song, and then I would just grab the fills that I liked and the parts, and I did the editing ourselves. And what was cool with the ADATs is you could do not only track delay on individual tracks, but you could delay the machines.
Okay.
So if you had, let's just say one tape had 8 tracks of drums, and then you had an empty tape below it. Well, there's multiple ways, but you could basically offset the tapes to do different things. So let's say we have the first machine with 8 tracks. The second one has 8 tracks, but it's a different take, right? So the take on the second tape was at 15 minutes on the tape. The keeper take up top was at 5 minutes. So then all I would have to do is offset the second machine by 10 minutes.
Okay.
And those would be playing together.
Interesting.
And then I could then grab the tom fill on verse 2 and copy it up to the first machine.
Okay.
And then that's what we did. So I would just go through and just write down the times that I liked each section. Maybe I liked the outro on take that started at 22 minutes. And then I'd like the first intro off of take that started at 15 minutes, and then you just kind of comp them all together.
I did not know you did all that for the album.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was just that made it. Once we could start doing that, it made our life easier because then we knew we didn't have to get that one a great take. You could do mostly. It wasn't a ton of edits, but it was just like it'd be like a great take, except for like one fill would just suck. You're like, I don't want to redo the whole thing.
That's kind of the beauty of the old way of recording is you had to get it right, but also what a headache when you're paying hourly or you're trying to do it right the way you want to hear it. And it's crazy that album, how much work you put into those drum tracks. Because you did record to a click now that I think about it.
Yeah.
That's the only way it was possible.
Yeah, really, when you're doing that many takes, you either got to make sure you're doing really close or if you're just going in, punching in to grab like a tom fill, you got to be on the click. But if you're going to take like the first half of one take and then like the second half of the song, you can sometimes get away without a click on that. But
as long as you were in the same tempo area. That was kind of the easier way than back in the day cutting tape and actually splicing, which Lars Ulrich would do.
And honestly, like I learned how to cut analog tape later in life.
Funny.
Like I actually learned I learned how to cut tape so I could teach it at the college I taught at to teach my students because I was always into digital early. So I mean the fact that I got Pro Tools in the early 90s was in the digital era. That was people were doing it then, but it was way before the masses were into digital work.
Yeah, you were ahead of the curve. Isn't that weird? You were at that cutoff point where all of a sudden you still had to teach a little bit of tape splicing.
Yeah, and it was kind of fun for me because it was like I always wanted to do this, and it was part of the curriculum. So it was like, well, okay, so I would just go in and learn it. And had another engineer that was a guy that had been doing that forever and just taught me how to do it, and then I just taught it.
It's wild that you've taught how to cut tape.
Yeah,
it's like Dylan from Pitch Fever Band, bass player. He went to college in New York, I think, for film, and they were still teaching them how to do old school editing on the machine with tape and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then he's like, right after I graduated, everything went digital. So he's like, it didn't even like matter anymore, you know. So
it's like mechanics, you know, like those guys that were dealing with regular cars, and then all of a sudden all this, you know, electronic emissions, fuel injection, and all this stuff. Like, I think that's like, I always look at that because that's like, you had those guys that were just going, you know what, as soon as these older cars are gone, I'm out, I'm retiring. And then there's the guys that just said, so I'm going to learn all this new stuff and be a part of that next wave. So everybody has different things, and that's the same way with audio engineering. I mean,
depends.
Digital is really that kind of thing, you know, and that in the studio world and in the live sound world too. Analog hung on longer in the live sound world.
Interesting.
Well, I should say longer, but for the most part, but then once digital consoles hit, it's kind of funny because analog's coming back in the live world right now.
Is it?
Yeah, big time.
I wonder if that's going to happen with a lot of things, but right now the people that are freaking out, I think, are the Hollywood people that do animation, and also coders are kind of experiencing that thing where AI is taking over a lot of what they're doing. So you kind of have to wonder, do I join it somehow, or do I try to fight and do the original thing that I was trying to study?
Yeah.
I mean, with live sound, you and I have both seen it go all the way from the earliest stuff that we saw to now someone with an iPad, you know, not even a board anywhere, just walking around with an iPad and stuff. When you do live sound, you have a board, but you also walk around with an iPad.
Yeah.
Is that an advantage for you because you have everything, the sounds you always want in there, or could you do it all with an iPad?
Okay, so can you, or do you want to?
Okay,
There's
there you go.
Different story, because really it depends on the band. You know, when you're just looking at an iPad, you're looking at like you're like looking at a console through a little bit of a peephole, you know?
Sections.
So you're kind of looking at that. There are a couple of programs that you can really redesign things. If you don't have very many inputs, it's pretty easy to do it on an iPad.
Okay.
You know? But I come from the world that I like to, I treat every song as like a performance, and like I'm playing it as well. So even just small moves of the guitar parts, the guitar solos, vocals, you know, the snare drum maybe gets bumped on certain sections. Like I need to do that, and I really enjoy doing that. It makes me feel like I'm part of the band, and it makes me feel like we're creating this cool thing.
Yeah.
It's harder to do that on an iPad.
Sure.
You know, but you know, if you have a console with faders, it's great. But that being said, there's some venues, like last weekend that I was just at, there's no spot to have a console out front. I mean, you can't have wires down. You can't have a tent outside that's blocking everybody. Yeah. A lot of places you can. They have it figured out, but some you just can't do it. So I just had to, you know, I set the console on the side of the stage, and then I was just out front with the iPad.
Okay.
And honestly, it's boring to me because I couldn't do some of the thing. I tried to do some. But you know, some of the things like throwing different delays at spots and doing that, it's just harder to do. But if you're just working with a really simple band, an iPad's just fine, you know?
Yeah, that's what the guy did at the Rockwoods or whatever.
Yeah.
He just used that.
But here's the thing that you get with the iPad, which is such a huge tool, is that you can walk around and work on your mix in different parts of the room.
Yeah.
So you can hear it from the perspective of the person, you know, right at the front of the stage. You could literally, I would be standing, you know, in like the third row and just mixing right there to make it sound better for those people there. And then go all the way to the back and listen there, and then see, oh, it's boomy back here. I didn't know that. Yeah. Where if you're just standing by the console the whole time, you make it sound really good there, that can work. But sometimes you walk away and you're like, oh no, like I didn't know that. So the beauty, what I used to do was I would just leave the console, walk around quick, and remember what I want to change, and then go back and hopefully that change happens.
It doesn't seem like too long ago either to me.
No,
that you had to
I
do
mean,
that.
I mean, the iPad's been out for a long time. It's just a matter of what console you're using to work with that, you know.
I think we're the same, and we kind of like the feeling of things. That's why I still have a pedal board versus just, you know, the FM9 that I have over there.
Yeah.
Because when things go wrong, I just love to, you know, twist a knob and fix it. It just feels better, like more connection to me, like you said.
Yeah, even on a digital console, you know, it used to be, you would think an analog console, large and huge months of faders. Digital console, really not much faders, but there's still digital consoles with a fair amount of faders. But what's cool is on the digital consoles is you have layers. So,
that's right.
you know, you could have 64 inputs on your console and not even move at all. You know, where in the studio we'd have these large SSL consoles that have 64 channels on them or 48 or whatever, and you'd have to like go to the one side of the room to work on the kick drum and then go to the other side to work on the vocals. You know,
have to hire somebody to like help you do the mix.
Yeah, or automate it all, you know, those kind of things. We could go back to the Mackie console.
Yeah, that thing was a big part of your recording life, from what I remember.
Yeah, that was a big thing for me because once I started doing all these recordings, I realized there was some things I wanted to get. Like I needed more EQ, I needed more channels, I needed more outboard gear. Yeah. And on a console, if you could get a console that's got a nice EQ and more sends, so you can have different types of effects and different, you know, if you have that all built in your console, then you're automatically kind of upgrading right there. And then you can get various outboard gear to get compression and other things.
What did you have on the Tascam for like mid?
So I think what it was if I remember correctly, is it was what they call a selectable EQ. So it had a high, mid, and low, but I think the high and low were selectable. So you could either do like on the high 8K or 12K. So you could choose between the two, but you couldn't go in between those.
It was click, click.
Yeah,
one
it
or
was
the
like
other.
switch if you want 8K, and then nope, I want 12K. So
That's
it's
funny.
that
It didn't
instead.
sweep. It just that's funny.
Because sweepable is a whole different expense, you know.
Okay.
And what I'm not sure is it might have had a sweepable mid-range.
Oh, okay.
But I don't think so. I
think even this thing.
I
has
think
a
the one
sweepable
I was
mid-range.
talking about. Yeah, but we're talking about a big difference in age. Because this was new in the 90s.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Where I bought that console new for me, but it was like made in like the 80s. Like it was probably
Or even the
early
70s,
80s.
yeah.
My guess is that Tascam was early 80s because I don't think they were
I could
around.
look it up.
They might have been.
Yeah. So you had maybe a mid sweep, but you're not sure.
Yeah, I'd have to look that up. I can't remember, but
Okay.
I knew I needed to have more of a channel strip for things going in and then also in the mix down stage. So because the monitor section, even though I had a monitor section, it wasn't very detailed. So I didn't have much to work with over there. So I really wanted to kind of jump it up. Plus I needed more channels. That was the big thing.
Yeah.
So I added another 8 tracks of ADAT. So I had 24 tracks.
That was a big day.
Yeah.
3 stacked on top of each other.
Yep. And so that's when then I said, okay, it's time to bite the bullet because Mackie had came out with this new cost-effective console they made 16, 24, and 32 channel versions of it. So I got the 32 by 8. So it meant it was 32 channels by 8 buses. And I can't remember. I think it was $3,000 or $4,000, something around that range. It's a lot of money, but at the same time, not compared to recording consoles. I mean, if you're in a studio that had, say, a Trident or an SSL or a Neve or something, you're talking like over $100,000.
Oh, I was going to say 50,000.
Yeah,
Wow.
no, I mean like, you know, Trident consoles maybe 50 and up, you know, but those consoles from, you know, the 90s and earlier were very expensive because they weren't trying to make home studios back in those days.
They're not going anywhere, and they're going to be in a real studio forever.
If it was a home studio, you were like Toto and you bought like a real studio and just put it in your home. You know, it wasn't like cost effective stuff that could go into your studio.
Sure.
Yeah. So buying that 32 by 8 like opened up a whole new world for me.
Did you get 32 because you knew eventually you're going to get a fourth ADAT?
What I did originally is because I had 16 tracks and I wanted to have 16 inputs and then have it come on the second part of the console for 16 returns.
Okay.
So I could have that, because technically, I don't want to get too technical, but I was talking earlier about an inline console versus a split console. The Mackie 32 by 8 was a split, or excuse me, was an inline console. So, but I made it into a split.
Because you're used to it?
Yeah, and well, then you get the best of both worlds because you get the whole channel strip for the input, and then you get another channel strip with the full EQ for the returns.
Sweet.
Since I started with 16 tracks when I first got the Mackie, then I just did 16 and 16. But then I got that third ADAT, and then I had to figure out how I wanted to deal with that. So.
Did you eventually have to let that return side go?
Yeah, as long as I had the patch bay dialed the way I wanted to, I could go into record mode and mix mode and just switch it up, no problem.
By the way, I hated your patch bay.
Yeah.
Because you knew it because you did it.
Yeah.
You soldered it together. But I was always like, I don't know. I'm just guessing.
Yeah.
So anytime you taught me how to like patch in a delay, I had to like memorize the exact hole.
Well, for some reason, I learned all this technical stuff of how to wire consoles and patch bays and all this stuff, but I was never creative enough to label it properly. So it was always like either chicken scratch or memory or whatever. I don't know why, but it was so hard to figure out how to label those little things.
Well, they only give you, would you have to get a little tiny card and like somehow write on it?
Yeah. Well, this time, now I just do it in Excel and
Yeah.
then you just have a laid out and you just, print it out.
Yeah.
A little laser printer and it goes fine.
That's cool.
Yeah. But that, for some reason back in those days, that was the hard part. It was just not knowing how it was labeled.
Well, it made it hard for me, but I don't think you had very many guest engineers coming in. So you really only had to know it.
Yeah,
so
totally.
That's cool.
That was, the studio was built for me and then I would just set the things up for you and then you just go all night and do it yourself.
That's why I have just a real surface knowledge of recording, but I know a lot of it because of you. Yeah. We'll talk about that later, but man.
Yeah. So that was the Mackie. So then it really wasn't long. I got the 24 tracks and then I had to get another one. So I had 4 for 32 tracks.
That was insane. Like, did they always how tight were they locking together?
Oh, it depended on the day.
Okay. It's one of those things.
And then they also had different models over the years.
That's true. I was going to ask you about when you upgraded to the newer ones, but we're only talking about your recording stuff, but do you remember you were now in this other house where you had the whole basement as a studio? So you had a snake that went across the entire basement to like a drum room.
Yeah.
That was next to like a sauna and a pool.
Yep.
It's a crazy, I'll talk about it some other day, and then you had another room that you could do like guitars in if you were recording a full band.
Yep. So I took the control room and split it in half, put a window in it. So that way the vocalist it could be right in seeing each other in the control room. Because there's a lot of times once you're done with the drums, you just need one room.
That's true.
So we just did guitar overdubs in that room and you could just see right through the window.
Yeah. You had glass built like it was a real studio.
Yeah.
But it right across was still the same room, but you could have a vocalist and have it all soundproofed and everything.
Yeah, but having the drum room on the other side was great.
Yeah.
Just because it was, total isolation. It was hard to get headphones over there, but we figured that out. And
did you just run like a long cable, or did you eventually
I ran an unbalanced cable over 100 feet long.
What if there's any like delay issues or anything?
No, you don't really deal so much in delay when it comes to analog signal that way. You'd have to go a long way. It would be more of distortion factor.
Okay.
So being able to get. Plus, I didn't have great power amps. I didn't have great headphones. So those over the years would get, you'd build that up a little bit.
Made it work. At least you didn't have a cat that could like chew through cables. You had a dog, but 2 dogs.
Yeah. But having different rooms was great. And that's where, again, I always tried to find a way to kind of build the real world scenario there. That way, when I was done with my parents' house, that was the logical thing to move into a commercial studio.
Yeah. Which was cool, but it was also a bummer for me a lot.
Yeah.
But I was going to say, we didn't really finish up on when your teacher came to watch you record your final project, how good it turned out.
Yeah.
Like we did Fragmented, and to this day I listen to the mix and I'm like, wow, this is better than a lot of the weird, like actual recordings we ever did after that were.
Yeah.
Somehow, I don't know if he had the key.
I think we learned a big lesson. We didn't know that we were learning the lesson, but we learned a lesson that, you got to have good equipment. You got to have good instruments, but at the same time, if you have to pick only some of those, right? So good gear, good equipment, good, budget, those kind of things. Well, we could never have all of them at once.
Yeah.
So we would go to a recording studio that we could barely afford and spend very little time in there, and then hope for the best and expected it to sound like Metallica. And we realized that we're actually better off to maybe not have as good of equipment, as good a room, but have all the time in the world to just get it right, and to be able to, we tried so many scenarios with miking drums. I mean, it was just, because we could, and we weren't paying it by hour. So we could just try different things. We could put a mic on the wall and hear it and go, oh, that sucked. Okay, let's try something else,
Put a mic in the sauna.
Yeah. Yeah, and just move the drums in different rooms, point in different directions. We put speakers out in the pool and sent signal out there to have a reverb chamber. And just like, I'd read something in a magazine and I'd be like, I think I understand what they're saying. And then,
Steve Albini does this.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
Yeah, so we learned that really
I love that.
These great records that you hear, it's all about having all of those things, having great songs, great instruments, having great equipment and great expertise in the room.
Yep.
And tons of time.
Yeah. And back then we couldn't just capture the settings. You'd have to write down the settings to come back.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where you'd zero out the board and have to start over, but you had your methods, you had, I think, blank sheets where you could write the settings or take pictures or whatever we did back then.
Yep.
But how did you get Fragmented to sound so professional? I mean, I remember the first time you got the kick drum to sound like a kick drum.
Yeah.
Like by sucking out some of the mids at the right frequencies and all that stuff. Was that mostly your teacher helping you with that, or did you just mess with it till it sounded like that?
No, I think it was really, I think for me, it was all about that project, but it was also all the other projects I was doing at the time.
Okay.
Because every time you do a new project, you learn something new. So you hear a new, like somebody, you think you got it all figured out, and then somebody else brings in a whole different drum kit, a whole different player, all different sounds, and you're forced to then try to make that the best.
Yeah.
And then you're guessing. You're literally you're trying to work so fast so you can hear, 20 different versions of that kick drum in a 5-second period, just go. Okay. Hey, actually don't touch it. Sounds good. And it's just that's why I tell people that recording is an art. It's not, there's not really this is what you do. Music is art. It's what you want it to sound like, what you think, what's your vision, is so important that it's you could see a painting on a wall and you might think that painting is ugly and sucks, and the next person could come up and look at that painting and think it's the most beautiful thing they've ever seen.
Yeah.
And that's audio.
That's like
sound.
mixing being so subjective to where you might think a drum sounds horrible, and then some other guy's like headbanging to it. Like, this is awesome.
Totally. Someday people are going to like Lars' snare drum.
Someday, I'm waiting for that day on St. Anger. But back in the day, I know you didn't think this way, because you were more like mechanical about it, right? You were like, just tell me what frequencies to boost. But now you like listen. I mean, you were a little bit like that, because I remember Pepke saying he wanted to make every sound huge and incredible. And even back then you were like, no, it all has to work together like a symphony, So I guess you did have a grasp on that.
So, that is exactly right. Like some people, there's a thing called solo where you can just solo out each individual microphone. So some people would think that their way to make something sound incredible is to listen to each thing and make it sound great, and then unsolo that, and then listen to the next thing and make it sound great, and then keep going, and then listen to it all together, and it's going to be this magical thing. And it, again, back to the painting thing. a great painter will know when they put this little dot of color here that they can grab a different color and then accent that and then do this over here and do it. Next thing you know, it's a picture.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about mixing or recording is that you kind of have to have this vision and then find a way to get there. But when you know nothing, it's hard to have a vision.
Right.
But what you can do is you can listen to things that you love and then try to get there. So we're not talking about Mix 101 right now, but one of the biggest things I think for my, how I learned and how I taught myself was to have my favorite things instantly that I could hear in my settings. So like the Metallica Black Album or something, or Pearl Jam 10 or whatever, something that I could put on my speakers right in my environment and then listen to that and then listen to mine, listen to that, listen to mine, listen to that, and then listen to mine, and then be depressed when I hear mine.
Yes.
And then and then you would do all that, and then you go listen in the car, and that's when you really be depressed. Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. Or you come back the next day and go, what was I hearing? You know,
Yeah.
so that's why it's good to like have fresh ears or whatever. But
Yeah.
remember the time we were recording and Gary let it like run wild on the board for some reason? And Al and I were trying to have like Pantera guitars, so we just cranked up the bass,
Yeah.
like all the way up. We didn't know that it's a whole picture that you're dealing with. So I think that's really cool that even back then you had the wherewithal to know it had to all fit together.
Yeah, and then we started to understand that sound, and we realized that was like the same. We called it the rubbing sound that Injustice for All had for the guitar. It was like too much low end on guitars. Where no wonder they had the bass so low that there wasn't any low end. So they were trying to get that with the guitars. Had they just taken that rub off the guitars and turned the bass guitar up, it would have been a whole different thing. But that's another discussion.
That's Injustice for All in a nutshell. And that's when we actually took a deeper listen to like Dimebag's guitars, and we're like, it's really not low end. There's a mid-range, there's a bite to it, but it's full somehow. And I think just with that frustration, it was like the mother of invention. You had to figure out how to get there on your own. So
totally. And that's what you do. And I do that to this day. I have references. I use references all the time.
Yep.
And because sometimes you can just be in a vibe and you could just be really relaxed and you're mixing a song and you're like, this sounds great. And then you realize you just kind of like go back and you go, oh, there's like no high end because I was relaxed and my ears didn't want to hear all that high frequency. And then you put on your reference and you're like, oh no, I'm nowhere in the ballpark, I
love reference tracks, even though it is depressing sometimes.
Yeah.
One time I thought I had the answer. I thought you just low cut everything, because I thought bass always kind of like fights itself and it ruins everything. So I was low cutting every single thing, at least a little bit. And I put it in my car, and it was like when you have those boom boxes with the 3D bass, but with the bass shut off. There was no body to it. And I'm like, you can't just put one rule to everything. Yeah. That's what's so frustrating, but also what's so cool about mixing.
Yeah, absolutely. So. And then also, one of the biggest things you can learn from is when you're recording is to mix what you recorded, because it sounds funny, but like you capture it, you think you're doing the best in picking the sounds and your mic placement and all that.
Okay.
But you don't know how good you did until you try to mix it.
That makes sense.
And then when you mix it, you hear all the flaws that you did. Like, oh, I didn't realize that, my snare drum has a ton of hi-hat bleed going through it. Or, now when I want to get my toms to sound a certain way, I got all these cymbal bleed going through. Or, or just the position of your vocal mic. If you have it too high, you're going to have a different tone nasally, maybe bright.
Sure.
If you have it too in front of the mouth, you're going to get this proximity effect and have too much low end and plosives going on. If miking up a guitar amp, if you have no idea about phase relationship, you might put two mics on and totally screw up your tone just by having two mics on there.
That took me the longest to figure out was phasing. One time I was recording and I couldn't get the guitars to work at all. I realized that it was out of phase. All I would have had to do was hit one button and it would have fixed it. So
I remember, when I would teach recording, and I would work with some of my students, and they would play me some of their projects, and they come and take a listen to my final project, and I'm like, okay. So I sit down, I listen to it, and I'm like, okay, and I'll say, let me try something, and I would like and I'd go and mute like 8 tracks and not change one thing, just mute 8 of their microphones. And they'll be like, what did you do? That sounds so much better, And they're just like it's like magic that I just waved over it. But what they didn't realize is they had all these tools and tracks at their disposal. They didn't realize by adding all these things and not understanding some of the phase principles and how that works, or masking techniques, that they were making it worse by adding all those things.
Sometimes when you record, you think more is better. Like put a million mics on the drums,
totally, yeah.
Do all this stuff, and then you just go up to the basics, and you're like, okay. Sometimes you don't need all that extra stuff. It's nice to have. I heard Dave Grohl once say one time, he's like, we have room mics all the time and drums. Usually we turn them way down. It's like, It seems like a big deal when you're doing it. And I'm glad I have it in the mix, but usually you just cut those way back anyway.
Yeah.
So
that's like they were, Brendan O'Brien was talking about recording the Chili Peppers.
Yeah.
And he was saying the majority of the final drums were 4 mics.
Really?
On those on
just minimal.
Blood, Sex, Sugar, Magic. That album was 4 kicks there and some like overhead, were kind of overhead room mics.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's insane. I mean, I believe it. Now that I've gone through this journey, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to ask you eventually about hi-hat isolation, because that's something I still can't do. I end up shutting off my hi-hat mic all the time, and it's fine. So I'm doing something wrong. Okay, so we have, when did you go to the newer ADATs? Because they turned gray all of a sudden, right? And they became, was it the same bit rate?
No, they moved to 20-bit. So 16-bit were the blackface ones.
Okay.
And 16-bit was still great. That was, the CD was 16-bit. So,
that's right.
You had to come, no matter how high of your bit depth, you had to come back down to 16-bit for the final master.
Sure.
So there was always that, does it really matter to go higher? And then ultimately we decided, yes, it does matter. Even to keep all of your tracks higher and then eventually go down to 16-bit is better.
I think I argued with you on that for a long time. I'm like, that doesn't make sense because you're downgrading eventually, but you've told me in a way that I understood at one point. So.
Yeah. It's just keeping the rest of as much in the highest fidelity as possible. That way, when you're running it through other outboard gear, those things, you're keeping the high fidelity through it, because those can degrade too. Okay. So if you're keeping all that at a higher level and then do your final master, I mean, that doesn't mean you can't have great sounding 16-bit recordings. I mean, it's just, but it is nice to have that. So yeah, ADATs went to 20-bit. They eventually went to 24-bit, but nobody really used those. They were too expensive.
I didn't know they had those.
Yeah. Okay. Really, computers were taking over by then, so they really didn't go.
So was this around the time, like when did you get into burning to a CD? Because that was a big deal for us.
Yeah. So that was a really big deal for me. I mean, looking at my age here, my first CD burner, I bought that CD burner used for $1,000.
Everything was like $1,000 back then, right?
Yeah.
Even your first 1 gig drive.
That was a lot of money at the time. Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly. And so the CDs we had were single speed. So if you had 70 minutes of music, you had to wait 70 minutes for it to record on the disc. And then each burnable disc, when I first started, each blank was $50.
No way.
Yeah, and then they went down to 30 for a long time.
We eventually got it down to 10, right?
Oh wait, yeah, and I mean, then it was cents. Once we started buying it.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
in spindles or whatever.
But for a large amount of the time, it was $10 to $15.
Imagine that. Like with Gary, I think we would burn a disc, but we had to pay $20 per.
No, I think with Gary, we paid $50. Yeah, 75. Actually, for the first ones, it was 75 a piece. Yeah.
Wow.
Matter of fact, it was Gary's burner that I ended up buying because he upgraded.
$75?
Yep, 75. But I mean, if you were a band recording a demo and you could walk out with a CD and not have to go to a pressing plant to burn, I mean, because then you had to burn 1,000 or more in order to get, and you're talking, $3,000 to $5,000 to burn CDs.
Yeah.
$75 for a disc. That was not. Matter of fact, I think the first one we did was that, and I know now, and he would charge us $65 for those. And then as the blanks started coming down, he would come down. But it would totally justify it, because if it was an hour to burn or 70 minutes to burn a disc, right? Because you could fit 74 minutes of music on a disc. It also occupied your computer. So you couldn't do anything.
That's true.
So that means that you literally, it should be more than that because you should be charging your hourly rate.
I was going to ask if you did that too. Yeah.
As well. So now we just ended up doing where you just charge for the blank, what it would be. So he was probably getting blanks for $40 and then charging $75 for
that's
thing.
insane.
So
that's why when you got your own, it seemed like a miracle.
Yeah.
You could burn your own CDs now.
Yep. And I would charge $50 a burn, and it was great. I mean, I was in my parents' basement being able to burn a CD.
Yeah.
Now it's just nothing for people to know. I mean, that's almost like, what's a CD now?
Right. You just email them the MP3 or whatever.
Yeah. But at the same time, that was an awesome thing to be able to have that.
So I forgot to ask you, before that, you were bouncing to cassette for people, right?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So I would make the master to a DAT tape, a digital audio
That's
cassette.
right.
And then you'd run the DAT tape and make a cassette copy for
It's
people.
funny, DATs never became commercially, acceptable to everybody.
Yep. The mini disc kind of was trying to do that,
Yeah.
and then the disc the compact disc just took over. But,
That's crazy.
and then because recordable, then they came out with standalone CD recorders that you didn't need a computer.
I remember that.
You could just run your DAT tape or run your board right to the computer. The
Recorder.
HHB made one that was really popular. I had a
Alright.
couple of those.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, how many Maxell tapes did we go through back then?
Oh, yeah.
Remember those gray ones?
Yeah.
I still owe you like $1,000, I think.
Yeah.
Because you would buy packs of them.
Yeah.
And I would just do my stupid demos all the
Yeah.
time and just record onto those. So
Well, then it was also understanding what the difference between a high bias tape versus a normal bias.
Yeah, that's right.
And you could run those Maxells were the best sounding, but you had to have a really good cassette deck in order to run a hot level to it, and then it would never fail. Like the decks, like the left side would get weird, and because those heads were so small.
yeah.
And we were always using like prosumer cassette decks, like Sony's or whatever. And, I remember I finally got a Nakamichi cassette way later. And that was like an expensive cassette deck to be able to run for people. And then by then the CD took over. So I hardly used it anyways.
That's funny,
But-
right? As it changes over.
Yeah.
Man, just to think you started on cassette, burning to cassette for people, and we could never get the levels really great, right? It always seemed like
Yeah.
there was a hiss and
Yep. And I hated it because it was so inconsistent.
Yeah.
For when you would make a mix, you'd run it to cassette, and then the client would take it home, and they would be listening on a different cassette deck that made it sound way different.
Yeah.
And they'd be like, well, it doesn't sound the same as it did in the studio. And you're like, well, I had guys that would bring in their boombox and then play it in there, and it would just be like, distorted and just crappy. And yeah, it was just, I hated cassettes. I mean, that was the cool thing about CDs is they were consistent. They were digital. So like, even though you had different converters on CD players and they could handle that different, but it was nowhere near
it
the
was pretty
playback
consistent.
heads. Yeah.
After all that happened, I'm trying to think of, you had the 4 20-bit ADATs, so 32 tracks.
Yep.
Okay. And then
And actually I had a mix of 16 bits and 20 bits.
Okay.
Eventually I owned 13 ADAT machines.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And the joke was how do you keep 4 machines running? Have 10,
Because one's always going to break or something.
Yeah. Those
I
things.
remember when one would go down and you'd just be like, we're done for the day, sorry. Or you have to go down to like 8 tracks or
It would
16.
never fail. You'd have 4 of them, and the third one would be the one that would fail. I don't know
Start
what
flashing
that
some
was.
code or something.
Yep.
I hated it when you would pull it out in the tape. Back when I was a kid, when you pull out a VHS tape or
Yeah.
even a cassette tape and the tape's going, pulling out,
Ugh.
it's the worst feeling. If you don't have a backup, you're pretty much screwed,
Yeah.
in the ADAT world. Okay, so, and you were burning CDs. I remember you buying the 1 gig drive. I think that was for your
Yep.
Pro Tools, so you could master and all that stuff.
Yep.
That was a big deal. $1,000 for 1 gig. Take
Yeah.
that in. Take that in. I remember it arriving, and it was the biggest deal ever.
Yeah. I bought a 2 gig drive this big the other day for $69. 2 terabytes.
I was gonna say 2
2
gigs?
terabytes.
Yeah, that's
not 2
hilarious.
gig. For $69.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
I try not to take it for granted. That's why every time I have something that's really high tech, I always remember this thing is like 20 things that I used to have to actually carry around,
Yeah.
After all that, was this when you started to flirt with moving to a studio? Because I don't wait.
Yeah, it was kind of in the middle of that.
When did you get the Paris system?
That was when I moved to the commercial studio.
Okay.
Yeah. So this would have been middle 90s. I moved to in the middle. Oh, let's see, it was about middle of 96, 97-ish when I moved to a commercial studio, and Pro Tools was starting to come about as being the big one, even though I had already had the small version.
Yep.
But there was studios around that were all Pro Tools, you know, and there was kind of a mixture. There was analog reel-to-reel rooms that were 2-inch 24 tracks. There was rooms that were all digital. There was just a blend of things going on. You know, $20,000 for a Pro Tools system to be able to have the amount of inputs that I needed to track at the same time. You needed to have, for a pro studio, you needed to have at least 24 tracks.
Okay, I was going to guess
24
16.
inputs.
Okay.
16, but not really. I mean, there was some studios that were kind of living by that 16 track, but that was kind of a prosumer room a little bit, you know. No, there was great stuff coming out of some of those rooms, but to really kind of compete with the big rooms, you had to have at least 24.
Okay.
And up, because once computers started going, that was kind of the way to go.
Yeah. How labor intensive do a computer back then was 24 tracks? Was it just you had to have probably an insane Mac?
Yeah, I mean, that was the cool thing about Macs is that all the Macs that were built were made for that stuff.
Okay.
Because they were made for the only people that really had those Macs in the early days were guys that were doing audio, video, or graphics.
Yep.
You know,
I remember
mean,
that.
and they had the heavy duty graphics cards. They had the dedicated RAM. They had the bus slots that they could, and they also had high SCSI drives that could run at higher RPMs, like 10,000 RPMs.
Okay.
So that would spin really fast, so you could transfer the data to the drives quick enough.
Okay. I remember SCSI.
Yeah. So that's why that drive was $1,000, because, you know, for one gigabyte drive, you could get a cheaper one like that you put in a PC or IBM at the time.
Yeah.
But they weren't fast enough to stream audio to it. You know?
Okay.
So you had to get a high quality, fast. They called them AV drives at that time, which is just meant they were above 7,200 RPMs when they would spin rate.
AV as an audio video? Or
Yeah.
something? Okay.
Yeah. So you just needed to have that kind of system to be able to do that. But again, you paid for your Mac, and you could get that right out of the box.
Okay.
I mean, because Macs, you couldn't really hot rod them. They were what they were. You bought them, you paid a lot for them, and they already had all that stuff. Where PCs you could get for way cheaper, but they were built for like offices, and, you know, I'm talking the early days.
Yeah,
now you can get incredible PCs and Macs and all that stuff.
Well, back in the day, all you could do to Macs were like add RAM, right?
Yeah,
and some memory.
Pretty much.
About
I
it.
mean, you could beef up the hard drives and then add. They were expandable. That's another thing that was cool, is you could get it with a certain amount of gigs of RAM or a certain amount of hard drives, and then they had bays where you could add more drives. You could add extra RAM, a lot of RAM, if you had the money to do it.
Yeah.
You know,
that was a big deal when you started like upping your systems.
Yeah. But now, like, Macs now have gone away from that. There's not a lot of user upgradable things. You have to buy it for what it is.
Yeah.
You can't just add more RAM. You know, some you can, but depends on the model.
Yeah.
They're just doing that to keep the costs down. They're soldering the RAM right to the motherboard now, which means you can't change it. But it also means that you just buy what you need.
Yeah,
You know?
I could see that.
Yeah.
So not a lot of opening up these new Macs and
Not
fidgeting
really.
with them like we
Yeah.
used to. Okay.
Not really. But yeah, so that was kind of a crossroads for me. I was seeing that the computer world was coming, and I had to figure out how to get into that world.
You saw it before a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, the big guys in town could spend the money and had Pro Tools rigs, and I couldn't do it. I just didn't have the money to do it. I was moving into a studio, and we barely had any money to pay for rent and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
And I wanted to, I needed more microphones and all this other stuff. And I just couldn't imagine dropping that amount of money at one time to get a Pro Tools system. Although that's what I wanted to do,
Luckily there was Paris.
Well, yeah. So then there was other companies that were making different options. You know, there was one called a V8 system, and there was some other things. And then Ensoniq, who made keyboards,
I had one.
It came out with this Paris system.
I forgot that was Ensoniq.
Yeah, Ensoniq Paris, and it was an incredible system. It was super cool. It was, you know, it just didn't have the massive, you know, name power of Avid, and
it was like the Betamax of,
but it was a really cool system, and I think the expensive system was about $4,000 or something.
That included, like, how big was the interface or whatever? It pretty huge.
Well, it was like a modular rack, so you could buy inputs and outputs and put them in the rack. So, you know, it was multiple spaces, but yeah, you could kind of modify it to have what your needs were.
That's cool.
If you wanted a bunch of outputs because you want to go to an analog console, you could have the outputs on there. If you needed more inputs, you could do that. They also made smaller systems too. So if you just wanted like 2 in, 2 out, you could get a way cheaper thing.
Okay.
But
I like that modular idea is pretty cool for back then.
Yeah. And to me, that was like, okay, that was still a stretch getting that kind of money, but it allowed me to be able to have, you know, an entire system. And you could record, like at that time, you could record 128 tracks.
That's what I remember. It was
it was in banks of 16, and then you had to bounce each 16 bank.
Oh my God, I remember.
But I mean, that system stuck with me for a while, and I started getting jobs down in Atlanta and working at different rooms, and I was shipping that back and forth with me and using that to record records because I could just, you know, put it in a box and
I didn't know you were shipping it. That's crazy.
Yeah.
So would you just be gone one week? Like, oh, where's the Paris system?
Well, yeah, because the main studio was still ADATs.
Okay.
And then I bought the digital system so I could start syncing things up, and I wasn't doing everything inside the computer. I was tracking things in the computer.
Gotcha.
But I was still kind of testing it, you know. And then I realized, I can do so much in there, but I wouldn't. What I would do is I had an ADAT. They made an ADAT module for the Paris system.
Okay.
So then when I would go to mix, I would transfer all the Paris stuff and pare it down to 32 tracks.
I remember
doing
that. Yeah.
And then mix it on the console with the analog gear. But that, you know, that was kind of, again, you're always afraid to just change something completely. So you would have your certain thing, and then you'd grab onto new technology and then try to integrate it. And if looking back at the story that we told tonight, that's exactly what I did my whole career.
It's like 1 foot and then it's safe. Then you go to the next. Yeah, that's a great idea, especially when you're working with clients. You don't just want to jump to a whole new system and have it explode. It's like upgrading your computer nowadays before a session. It's just crazy. I remember the first time you transferred over to Paris, and all of a sudden I saw the waveforms, and it just seems so crazy to see that many waveforms, because before I was just used to 2 when you were mastering, and then you told me I could go in and like cut out like those on the bass track. I remember you were telling me to get rid of some of these noises on there, and I couldn't believe you could do fade in, like fades and stuff like that. It was such a miracle at the time. Yeah. But the one thing I'll always remember about Paris, besides how crappy my life was around that time, 96. Yeah, that was hell. But just the way the interface looked on the screen, gold. Yeah. And the buttons that it had, it seemed very PlayStation-y or something. I don't know how to explain it, but that gold look was definitely what they were going for, I think.
Totally. It was funny looking, but it was at the time it was a cool graphic look because it was in an era of like GUIs, graphic user interfaces weren't that cool on computers.
Yeah, you're right.
Even Pro Tools, the big name Pro Tools, looked pretty lame.
Paris looked like the high class version.
Yeah,
of it
exactly.
Something.
Yeah. And there was like Cubase and what was
I was going to ask you Cubase, and there was something else.
Steinberg's Nuendo.
Yeah,
that was another one. There was one we used too, Digital Performer. Yep. There was all these other companies that were kind of trying to work their way into that. But the one thing that the other companies didn't do was back it up with the hardware. And that's where Pro Tools was always together. Like That's what is the most expensive because it wasn't only the software, it was the cards that went in and then their interfaces.
Yeah.
And like each interface, like each 8 channels to get into your system would be, $3,000 to $5,000. So you're not only talking about buying the system, you're talking about buying three outboard interfaces for like 15 grand plus what your Pro Tools system costs.
Yeah.
So that's where Paris was killer because it was $4 grand all in. So it was like $4 grand for the software plus your hardware, and it gave you the ins and outs that you needed as well.
God, when you said that, I had flashbacks of old Pro Tools interfaces, but it was what were the early ones?
Well, there was the 888s.
888s. What were the single rack ones that had 2?
That was so the one that I had for the 4-channel was the 442.
Okay.
Yeah, and then
look that up.
And then they made the 888, which was the two spacer, which was black. And then they got it. And then when we got into the newer Pro Tools HD, those were the gray ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
Damn. It's so crazy.
So many different things over the years, but
I know I'm going to put visuals or pictures up whenever you mention something.
Yeah, that would be great just to see.
Yeah, just the evolution of it all. And then eventually what happened? You got finally enough to get the ADATs, or I keep saying that, the Pro Tools system, the way you want it.
Yeah.
Did you start right off with 24 tracks with Pro Tools?
I think actually the first Pro Tools system was 32 ins and outs. Yeah, because we needed it to interface right with the console, and we needed to have 32 at that point because you can't go backwards, So we already had 32 ADATs, 32 tracks of ADAT, and interfacing with our console. So basically, we just got a computer rig that would replace the ADATs, And to be honest, the Paris system never really even became our main recording unit in our main
That's
studio.
right. It was on the side room.
Yeah. I always used it to transfer in and out and edit and do other things, but it wasn't really until we committed to Pro Tools where it really replaced everything.
So pretty much went ADAT to Pro Tools, Paris for the editing, right?
Yep.
And I think of Paris as such a big deal only because back then John and Johnny were always on it doing their Create a Song stuff.
Yeah.
So I just have it in my brain that you use Paris way more than you probably did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it was used a lot. It just wasn't in the main A room because we'd transfer it and then we'd track like a full band and everything to to ADAT still, and then just transfer it in, edit, do all the things we needed, and then put it back to mix. Yeah.
So when you first had Pro Tools in the main room, did you have it with the ADATs and do any transferring, or did you just go right to the hard disk or hard recording?
That basically, because Pro Tools there was a smaller system in our B room that we would use to transfer.
I remember that.
And then, but as far as in the A room, we just switched it over.
How did
because
that
there was a point where I was starting to lose some projects because other people would have Pro Tools.
Yep. Once again, it's telling you need to move up.
Yeah. Yep. So all of a sudden, I'd be in Atlanta, and then my clients back at home would be working, and they got a chance to use a Pro Tools system, and they'd be like, "Hey, you don't have that, okay?" And so finally, it's like, well, it's a business decision. You have to have it.
Yeah, it became the standard for.
Yeah, I mean, at that time, for a pro level with lots of ins and outs, there was a couple of other options. But they were even more expensive than, and I'm trying to even think of what they were called.
Yeah.
There was a couple, Studer made one.
So they tried.
Yeah. There was one that was really great sounding. It actually sounded way better than Pro Tools, but it just couldn't.
Was it Cakewalk?
Take off.
I'm just
No. I cannot remember the name of it.
Well.
But real quick. So then during this whole time of this Pro Tools transition, I always kind of in the back of my mind wanted to have an analog machine as well, so that I always dreamt of having that 2-inch 24-track machine. So I ended up getting a Sony machine and then getting a 2-inch tape for 24 tracks. And the funny thing is at the time in the early 2000s, probably, a lot of people locally really wanted to record on analog tape, but they didn't understand what it meant to record on analog tape. So they'd come in, that would be one of our first questions on a call, when they'd call and ask about the studio. Do you have an analog tape machine? And be like, yes, we do. Okay, great.
This is after Pro Tools has already been.
Yeah,
okay.
so Pro Tools is around, but people still wanted that analog feel.
Yeah.
And we'd say, yep. And then they'd come in and they'd realize they would take a look at the tape cost, and at 30 IPS, 30 inches per second, how fast that would run, you would get 16 minutes and 40 seconds of music on a reel. Yeah, and then each reel was about $300.
Yeah.
So
that's probably
so if you had somebody doing an album, they'd have to pay over $1,000 just in tape cost.
Yeah, they don't think of that.
And locally here, during that time, there were some people that could afford that, but there was a lot of people that didn't even want to pay $1,000 for their demo.
Right.
So that would already. So I joked that we would have a tape machine, but it was mainly to get people to come to the studio. And then they realized too that you couldn't punch in much. You couldn't really edit much on it. You'd have to transfer it to do that. So that means they actually had to play the parts and be a good musician.
Yeah.
And so during that era, people were just starting to get used to saying, no, that didn't sound good, but you could fix it in the computer, right? Or you could auto tune it, or you can do those things.
People were just starting to get lazy.
Yes, yeah, yeah. My buddy John, he would always, when somebody would finish doing a vocal, he'd go on the talkback mic and he'd go, "Okay, that sucked. Come on in."
Oh, wow.
As a joke, we'll fix it later.
Yeah. I know. I try to explain to people sometimes what it's like now compared to when I was, I'd sit in and you'd let me do some recordings with people. And there was one guy in particular, he just 100 takes of one thing and it just wasn't getting it. Eventually we had to paste somebody else's track over his track. And he never knew. I won't say the name.
Yeah.
But it got to the point where I got so worn out from doing that, I never wanted to engineer ever again.
Yeah.
I don't know how you do it. It's just nowadays it's a lot easier.
Yeah.
But to be able to sing something out of tune, out of time, instantly fix it, and say you're good. That's mind-blowing to me. And back in the day, if you watch old documentaries of Heart in the studio, you see Ann Wilson singing something like 90 times and her voice is all ragged. It's like they really had to do it back then.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's good or bad because maybe she ruined her voice a lot from doing all that stuff, but
there's different levels of that, because I've seen that where we've worked with people that have struggled and they're never going to really get it.
Yeah.
So you just go, you know what? You're so close on this take. Let me just take it the next 5% to get it to where it should be.
Yeah.
But then there's times where I've worked with some incredible singers, that they can hit it. And there's times where they'll be like, "Oh, you could fix that, right?" And I'm just be like, "Oh, you're so good. Let's just run it one more time and you're going to nail it," know? And so there is a little bit of that level too. That
I'm glad you still try to make them do it real.
Yeah, I mean, when we can. I mean, you kind of start to know people's ability, and you just, no matter who it is, we want to just try to get the best out of them, And in somebody that maybe is a natural singer and used to being in the studio, used to hearing themselves in headphones, they're maybe here, and I try to take them to there, and then this other person's maybe here, and when we get to here, we're really happy because they jumped up to a certain point, but it's it is what it is, and that's how we were.
Yeah,
you would just your goal is to come in and make your next project better than your last.
I think Bill Bailey had a good way of letting us do our thing, but subtly guiding us to do a more professional way. Because when I listen to the recordings now, I go, he did a lot of things like we talked about that we didn't even know he was doing at the time. And he just doubled our guitars the right way. He set it the right way. He made the kick drum sound the way we, wanted it. And to this day, I'm very proud of the Red album, the Red demo for 6 hours. That's freaking insane.
Yeah. A lot of that, though, again, it's because we had it so solid. In the later days, as every band does, then when they create more newer stuff, they haven't been living with that stuff. They haven't refined it.
That's true.
So then they try to do it in the studio, and then there's so many opportunities to go in different directions, and you don't know what the final outcome is going to be.
You end up with the making of Pump, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why one time I had this crazy idea that we should all go in the studio and do something like that, and I thought we'd probably just go crazy, like with no material and just start writing on the spot. I think there was a time when we could have done that.
Yeah,
but
you have to be on your game, though.
Yeah,
you have to be on your instrument. Like for us now, for you it's different, but for the rest of the band, if we're hardly playing our instruments and then have to just struggle to get back up to speed and then try to write,
just tossed in a room together.
Yeah,
I don't know if
that's a hard task.
Yeah, I'd say. Yeah. Well, after all that, Pro Tools took over. And to this day, it's still what you prefer?
Yeah. I mean, everything is now, higher bit depth. So you can do up to 32-bit now. You can do higher sample rates. You can, you can do 196K, 192, I should say. I still don't even go that high anymore. I do everything in 96K.
Okay. I'm still at 48, I think.
Yeah. I mean, and that's actually just fine. 24-bit 48K is what is really good. The thing of it is iTunes and Spotify now are asking for high def masters now.
Oh.
So they want everything at 24-bit 96K.
Oh, I didn't know that.
If you go through these other companies and don't go directly through iTunes and Spotify, they won't take that. They're still taking 16-bit 44.1 thing. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's I forget some of those.
DistroKid.
Yeah, like some of those ones. I got clients that will use those, and those are great because they will get you on all the different sites and all that, and you don't have to they can handle all the hurdles it is to get directly.
Yeah.
But if you're going straight through distribution to Apple, you have to have it has to be a certain thing, and you also have to guarantee that there's no overs. And there's a what do they call it? Mastering for iTunes. There's you can actually be a certified master engineer for iTunes.
That's cool.
Yeah. It's just that you know how to read a meter properly is what it means. But
I'm glad they don't give me too many parameters when I upload my podcast to iTunes or whatever it's called, Apple Podcasts. So far it's been working, and they don't ever send me any notices or anything like that.
Yeah.
So it's probably just for the music stuff.
Yeah. Well, because a lot of it stems from YouTube, and YouTube is like the lowest quality audio.
Yeah,
it's way below. It's like a bad MP3 basically.
Sometimes I'll use that as my reference, and then I'll go to iTunes instead. I'll be like, oh, that's way different.
The trick is to do Spotify and then go into your settings and tell it to play back at the highest quality.
Okay.
Because the Spotify will dumb it down because it is thinking you want to stream it. And you're using more data if you do that. So if you go into your settings and turn it to a higher quality, you got at least a decent playback. Yeah.
Awesome. I wish YouTube would allow that.
Yeah, I don't think they do.
I know you can change the resolution, but that doesn't affect the audio the same, I don't think.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Just talking out of my booty.
Yeah.
So I think maybe we should wrap it up soon. But where you're at now, as far as everything you do from the humble beginnings of having, wanting one of these, to running live sound now, like working festivals. I mean, you've run sound for bands like, was it Warrant or
Yeah. So, Great White. I did some monitors with them. Slaughter.
So crazy.
I did some stuff where I was teching with Warrant a little bit, but mostly it's bigger local bands here doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but they often play those stages now. It seems like the big stages we always dreamed of.
Yeah.
And we talked about this in another thing, but when Heartless played that outdoor thing with Foghat.
Yeah.
This funny part of that story is you could have had us louder, I remember, but they had some sort of meter and they wanted you to just stay below a certain volume. And then they found out later that the meter wasn't calibrated right or something.
Yeah.
So I'm like, that was probably your first big outdoor PA system. But I don't know, you eventually got there.
We could talk about those. I have all those stories about, there's that, imposter syndrome, where you have when you're just getting into something and you're not totally confident, but something's wrong and you don't know how to convey it because you just assume other people know more than you.
Yep.
And you don't want to come off as like a big jerk and being like, hey, because we were just the opening band. We wanted to, just fit in and be great. But I knew it wasn't right when they were telling me that we had to be at 95 dB on this meter, which 95 dB is pretty loud.
Yeah.
In a big outdoor venue, that's not super loud, but it's bearable.
That's way back where you were, though.
Yeah,
95.
way back from at the soundboard.
Yeah.
But I hardly had it up, and it was going past 95. And it turns out that there's a weighting system, and they had it set to the wrong weighting system. So it was reading all the frequencies. It was, it was a C weighting instead of an A rating. And it just means how sensitive the microphone and what frequencies it's picking it up.
So it could have been picking up all the sub
Yeah.
frequencies.
And so all this was led is because the day before they were having lots of neighborhood complaints, and the cops were making them stay at a certain level. So the guy went and got a decibel meter and didn't know how to set it right.
Oh, man.
And yeah, and that's what happened. So I didn't want to say, hey, I'm not going to make the cops mad, so we'll just do whatever you need.
Yeah.
And finally I just did what we needed. And then as we're going, the next band, I think it was Foghat actually.
Yeah.
Or what was the band before them? It was
the Guess Who?
The Guess Who
was headlined.
Okay, so then it was Foghat then.
Yeah.
So their engineer was talking with them, and by the time we're done, they had figured out that the weighting was wrong.
That sucks.
And then they come on, and they're way louder.
So we could have been how much louder, you think?
I mean,
20 dB?
oh no, I don't know about that. It would have been. I honestly, at that, when you're 90 to 95, 5 dB sounds a huge amount. I mean, every 3 dB is twice as loud to our ears.
Oh, really?
So it really would have been probably 5 dB difference.
Okay.
But it would have made the world of a difference from the integrity and the clarity throughout the whole, because it just turned to mush. If you're up by the stage, it was clear but I mean, ultimately we were running a big outdoor event at like 90 decibels.
Could have used that extra push, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it wasn't a disaster. It was just more of like, dang it, I knew something wasn't right.
Yeah.
And had all the experience I have now, I could have went back and explained it to them, and then we could have had a good conversation about it, and then we could have got what we wanted, which was because we weren't trying to blast everything. It was just trying to be realistic for an outdoor rock concert.
Yeah, and we had such big expectations because we never really played a stage that big with Heartless. And all of a sudden we're out there, and when you told me that, my heart sunk a little bit because it was so hot and dreadful on stage. We worked our asses off that I wanted the best thing to come out of it. But the great things did come out of it. I mean,
and actually it sounded good where most of the people were.
Yeah, everybody seemed happy.
Yeah, it sounded fine. It was just, that was my big day to be on a big system, and I wanted to rock it,
Well, just like anything in your life, I think you get humbled a little bit in the beginning, and then you just take off from there. So it works out. Yeah. For me, I usually don't get humbled till way later, and then I just crash. Yeah. So we have different trajectories in life, I think. So.
It's just how experience goes, you just wish like you learned something. Every time you do something, you learn something. Yeah. And then you go back and you go, my gosh, I can't believe if we could go back and hear all those things, I mean, it must have just sounded awful. You know?
Well, the worst thing would be is if you kept going and you never learned anything. That might mean that you're just closed-minded. Right. Or you're not paying attention to what could be better. So
cool. We could talk for days about that.
Yeah, we'll have to do a whole like maybe a live production podcast someday, because there's a lot of people getting into that, I think, that want to maybe get out of their studios a little bit and maybe try the live world a little bit. And
what would be really fun is to do some sort of Q&A too, because I bet some of your viewers would have some questions on recording stuff and live sound stuff.
That'd be great.
And maybe that could circle around something.
Yeah,
I think
I'll just bring it up on screen and we'll do it that way.
Yeah.
Good idea.
Great.
Any last things you want to say?
No, thanks for having me.
No problem. We were going to think, when we first started, I was thinking like half hour, we'll just quickly talk about, was it 2.5 hours?
I think so. Like that,
Got some editing to do. All right, Chris, thanks, man. And
Thank you.
I don't know, what's our next thing we're doing? Is any Sanctus stuff?
Not if I have anything to say about it.
Okay, unless I surprise you with another song, like Temptation of Sin.
Yeah.
All right, take care.
Thank you.